I never thought my life would feel this empty. At 52, with 2 grown children living their own lives and a husband, Richard, who seemed more invested in his consulting firm than our marriage, my days had fallen into a predictable rhythm. Morning walks in the park, afternoons spent at the library or tending to the flower beds, and evenings scrolling aimlessly through TV channels. It wasn't a bad life, but it wasn't exactly a fulfilling one either. And then came a Tuesday, a day that started as mundane as all the others. I had stopped by the neighborhood grocery store to pick up some staples: bread, milk, and the oranges Richard liked for breakfast. The produce aisle was quiet, save for the sound of a stock clerk humming along to the soft music playing overhead. That's when I saw him. He wasn't remarkable in the way that some men are. He didn't tower over the shelves or have that magazine cover perfection. But there was something about him, the way he moved with an easy confidence as he examined a carton of strawberries. His dark brown hair was slightly disheveled, as if he had been caught in the wind, and his hazel eyes carried a spark of mischief. I was reaching for an apple when it slipped from my hand and rolled right to his feet. "Gotta run away," he said, picking it up and handing it to me with a grin. "Thanks," I managed, feeling a blush creep up my cheeks. "No problem. Apples can be tricky," he said, and I couldn't help but laugh. "Tricky fruit. I'll keep that in mind next time." He extended a hand. "I'm Ethan, by the way." "Claire," I replied, shaking his hand. We chatted briefly about the absurd price of organic vegetables and the questionable quality of grocery store coffee beans. Before I knew it, I was smiling in a way I hadn't in months. When I finally walked away with my cart, my heart felt lighter, as if that brief interaction had peeled back a layer of monotony. I caught myself looking over my shoulder once, half expecting him to still be there. It was a small, insignificant moment, or so I told myself. Little did I know, it was the beginning of something that would awaken feelings I thought I had long since buried. I returned to the grocery store the following week, not entirely sure if I was hoping to run into Ethan again or just looking for an excuse to get out of the house. As I browsed through the shelves, I told myself I was being silly. He was just a polite young man who happened to strike up a conversation. But then I saw him, standing by the bakery section, carefully inspecting a loaf of bread as if it held the secrets of the universe. My heart did an odd little flip. Decided to brave the tricky fruits again, he called out when he noticed me. I laughed, a sound that felt foreign to my own ears. Sticking to the safe aisles this time. From there it became routine. Every week, I'd bump into Ethan, and somehow we'd end up walking the aisles together, talking about everything and nothing. He told me about his life, a 28-year-old freelance graphic designer who had recently moved back to town after a bad breakup. He was working on rebuilding his life, taking on odd jobs, and figuring out his next steps. I told him about my kids, Anna, my eldest, who was finishing her residency in New York, and Jacob, who was starting his own tech company in Seattle. I even mentioned Richard, though I carefully avoided painting too vivid a picture of my marriage. One day, as we stood by the coffee aisle, I admitted, "I think this is the most I've laughed in weeks." "Then I guess I'm doing my job," he replied with a wink. It wasn't just his charm. Ethan had this way of making me feel seen, like I wasn't just some invisible middle-aged woman wandering through life. He asked questions, remembered little details, and seemed genuinely interested in my answers. As the weeks turned into months, our encounters extended beyond the grocery store. He started suggesting places I should visit, small parks, quirky coffee shops, and even once brought me a book he thought I'd enjoy, leaving it with the store's cashier when he didn't catch me there. It felt innocent, harmless even. But deep down, I knew there was something more brewing beneath the surface. I found myself smiling more, waking up each day with a flicker of excitement. Richard noticed the change but chalked it up to my newfound hobby of exploring the city. He didn't ask questions, and I didn't offer explanations. But I had to wonder, was this just a friendship? Or was I dancing dangerously close to something I couldn't turn back from? It was a crisp Friday morning when Ethan suggested we grab coffee at a little cafe he discovered downtown. I hesitated at first, unsure if stepping outside the grocery store bubble we'd created was a good idea. But curiosity won out, and soon, we were seated by a window, the scent of freshly brewed coffee wrapping around us like a warm embrace. "Isn't this place great?" he asked, gesturing to the eclectic decor. walls covered in mismatched frames and bookshelves crammed with old novels. "It's charming," I admitted, sipping my latte. He smiled, leaning back in his chair, completely at ease. "I figured you'd like it. You seem like someone who appreciates the little details." I blushed, caught off guard by the compliment. "You're surprisingly perceptive for someone so young." "Age is just a number," he replied smoothly, his eyes meeting mine. Something about the way he said it made my breath hitch. For the first time, I couldn't dismiss the flutter in my chest as just friendliness. The conversation flowed effortlessly, as it always did, but there was an undercurrent of something new, something electric. When he laughed, I noticed the way his dimples framed his smile. When he spoke, I hung on to his words a little longer than necessary. Later, as we walked back to our cars, he turned to me and said, "You know, Margaret, you're not like anyone I've ever met. Talking to you feels different. Better." I froze for a moment, unsure how to respond. "I could say the same about you," I managed, my voice softer than I intended. That night, as I lay in bed, the realization hit me like a tidal wave. I wasn't just fond of Ethan. I had feelings for him. The thought terrified me. I was a 53-year-old woman, married for over 3 decades, with 2 grown children and a life built on routine and responsibility. Ethan was young, free-spirited, and everything my life was not. But the heart doesn't listen to logic. It just feels. I tossed and turned, questioning everything. Was I being ridiculous? Was this just a fleeting infatuation brought on by loneliness? Or was it something deeper, something real? When I finally fell asleep, it was with Ethan's smile lingering in my mind and a question I couldn't shake. What do you do when your heart dares to dream of something it shouldn't want? For days, I tried to push my feelings aside, burying them beneath errands, appointments, and the endless noise of life. But it was useless. Ethan's face crept into my thoughts at the most inconvenient times. His easy laugh, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the way he made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in years. The internal war between my heart and my head began to take its toll. I felt like a teenager again, plagued by uncertainty and giddy excitement. But unlike a teenager, I carried the weight of a lifetime of responsibilities. I stared at my reflection one evening, scrutinizing every line and wrinkle. What would people think? I whispered to the woman in the mirror. Society had its rules, unspoken but rigid. Women like me weren't supposed to feel this way, especially about someone so much younger. And yet, I couldn't ignore the way Ethan brought light into my otherwise monotonous days. The next time I saw him, we were back at the grocery store. He greeted me with his usual charm, waving a bag of apples. "Let me guess, you're here for the oranges again." I smiled, trying to keep my composure. "And you're here to raid the produce aisle?" He laughed, guilty as charged. "But seriously, I was hoping I'd run into you." Something in his tone made my pulse quicken. "Oh, why's that?" "I just enjoy talking to you, Margaret. You're different. You're not like anyone else I know." The sincerity in his voice made my throat tighten. I wanted to tell him I felt the same, that he'd become my favorite part of the week. But I couldn't. Not yet. That night, as I sat alone in my living room, the weight of my emotions threatened to crush me. I realized I had to face the truth. I was falling for Ethan, and it scared me to death. I poured myself a glass of wine, hoping it would quiet the storm inside me. It didn't. Instead, questions swirled like a relentless tide. Was this love, or was it just loneliness disguised as something deeper? Was I willing to risk everything I'd built for the chance at something real, something new? Most importantly, could I live with myself if I didn't at least try to find out? As the wine dulled my nerves, I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't keep running from this. But was I brave enough to take the next step? What would you do if you found yourself torn between the life you've built and the one your heart yearns for? The next few days were a blur. I could barely focus on anything except the idea of Ethan. His laughter, his touch when he handed me a gardening tool, the way he seemed to know just how to brighten my mood without even trying. Every moment we spent together felt like a secret, a stolen piece of time. But there was one thing gnawing at me. This couldn't continue like this. The small, fleeting moments weren't enough anymore. I wanted more. One evening, while sitting at the kitchen table, I toyed with the idea of inviting him over. It wasn't a decision I made lightly. In fact, I hesitated for what felt like hours, the weight of my marriage pressing down on my shoulders. But the thought of seeing him outside of the garden, in my own home, where we could be more than just the friendly faces that exchanged pleasantries, it was intoxicating. I knew my husband, Dave, was out of town again for work. He was always so busy with his job, leaving me to manage the house, the garden, and the silence that had become too familiar. I wasn't lonely for the sake of loneliness, but the absence of any real connection between Dave and me had left a hollow space inside. A space I hadn't realized was so empty until Ethan came along. It wasn't just about the attraction I felt for him, although that was undeniable. It was about how he made me feel. Alive, desired, seen in a way I hadn't been in years. I wanted to feel that again, to be reminded that I was more than a housewife, more than just someone's partner. Taking a deep breath, I finally dialed Ethan's number. It rang only once before he picked up. Margaret. His voice, so warm and familiar, made my heart skip. Hi, Ethan. It's me. I was wondering if you'd like to come over tomorrow. I've got some fresh lemonade, and I thought maybe we could chat for a while. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Sure, I'd love that. What time? 2 o'clock? I'll leave the door unlocked. Perfect. I'll see you then. As soon as I hung up, a rush of excitement flooded through me, followed by a wave of fear. Was I really doing this? Was I opening a door that could never be closed again? I shook my head, trying to banish the doubts. I wasn't sure what was going to happen, but I couldn't ignore the pull anymore. I needed to see him again, needed to understand what this connection was, even if it meant facing the consequences of my choices. I spent the next few hours preparing the house. Nothing extravagant, just enough to make it feel inviting. I wanted him to feel comfortable, but more than that, I wanted him to feel like he belonged. As I set the table, my mind raced. What if I made a mistake? What if this was all just a fleeting fantasy? But then, I remembered how he made me feel, how every moment spent with him had been genuine and real. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally doing something for me. Tomorrow would tell me everything. The morning of his visit, I found myself in a flurry of nervous energy. I tried to distract myself by cleaning the house, fixing a small vase of flowers on the table, and making sure the lemonade was just right. But the anticipation kept building inside me like a slow-burning fire, crackling with every passing minute. When the clock finally struck 2, I was already standing at the window, watching for his arrival. The sight of him walking down the path, with that relaxed yet confident gait, made my heart beat faster. He was wearing his usual work clothes, faded jeans and a t-shirt, but to me, it felt like he was dressed in something far more sophisticated. He had a way of carrying himself that was effortless yet magnetic. I opened the door before he even had a chance to knock. Ethan flashed me a smile, that same mischievous glint in his eyes that always made my stomach flutter. Hey, Margaret. You look beautiful, he said, his voice soft but genuine. I could feel the heat rise to my cheeks, and for a moment, I forgot how to speak. Instead, I stepped aside to let him in. Thanks for coming, I finally managed, offering him a glass of lemonade. Please, make yourself at home. Ethan sat down at the table, and for the first few minutes, the conversation flowed easily. We talked about everything. Gardening tips, the weather, the books we were reading. But as we spoke, I couldn't help but notice how natural it felt to have him here, how at ease we both seemed despite the tension that was quietly building between us. There was something in the air, a charge that neither of us could ignore. I could feel his eyes on me as I moved around the room, and every time I glanced back at him, he was watching me with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. Can I ask you something, Margaret? He said suddenly, his voice low, almost hesitant. I looked at him, a little taken aback by the seriousness in his tone. Of course. What is it? He paused for a moment, as if trying to find the right words. What made you invite me here today? I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm glad you did, but I have to admit I've been wondering. I swallowed, suddenly unsure of how to answer. The question felt loaded, like it was more than just about a casual visit. But I couldn't lie to him, not now. I guess I wanted to see you outside of the garden. I wanted to spend time with you. I don't know, Ethan. I feel like we have this connection, and I don't know what to do with it. My words came out in a rush, the truth escaping before I could stop it. Ethan's expression softened, and he leaned forward slightly. I feel it too, Margaret. More than I think either of us expected. His words hung in the air between us, and suddenly the room felt smaller, the space between us shrinking with each passing second. I could see it in his eyes. There was no denying the pull that had been growing between us since the moment we first spoke. He stood up then, slowly, as if he was giving me time to react, to stop him if I wanted to. But I didn't. Instead, I met him halfway, and when he kissed me, it was gentle at first, a quiet testing of the waters. But as the kiss deepened, I felt everything I had been holding back come flooding to the surface. Desire, longing, and a sense of freedom I hadn't realized I was missing. We broke apart, breathless, and I looked at him, my heart pounding in my chest. Are you sure about this? I whispered, my voice shaky. Ethan nodded, his hand still resting gently on my cheek. More than anything, he said quietly. And in that moment I knew. This wasn't just some fleeting attraction. This was real. And it was happening. I had crossed a line, one I couldn't uncross. But for the first time in years, I felt truly alive. And maybe that was all that mattered after Ethan left that afternoon. I stood by the door for a long time, my hand still resting on the knob as if I could somehow hold on to the moment. The kiss, the connection. It felt as if something inside me had shifted, something that had been dormant for years had been awakened. I had known love in my life, marriage, children, the quiet companionship that comes with years spent with someone. But this was something entirely different. The way Ethan looked at me, the way he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in ages, like I could be young again, free from the weight of my responsibilities and the expectations of being a wife, a mother, a woman of a certain age. But with those feelings came doubt and fear. How could I, at 53, be so drawn to someone so much younger? What did it say about me? Society had taught me that love was supposed to come with a certain set of rules, and age was one of those rules. I had spent my whole life trying to follow the prescribed path, but now, with Ethan, it felt as though I was stepping into unknown territory. And though I knew it was dangerous, I couldn't help but feel that maybe I was finally living life on my own terms. I sat down on the couch and tried to process everything. Was I just yearning for excitement, for something to break the monotony of my marriage? Or was this something deeper? I couldn't deny the pull I felt toward Ethan. The way his laughter made me smile, the way his touch made me feel as though I mattered, as if I was still desired. My husband, Mark, had always been a good man. He provided, he was dependable, but somewhere along the way, we had lost our spark. I didn't blame him entirely. Maybe it was just life, or maybe it was me. I had become so caught up in being everything to everyone that I had lost sight of what I needed. But Ethan, he reminded me of who I was before life got so complicated. He was raw, untamed in a way that felt both thrilling and terrifying. He didn't care about age or labels. He saw me, not as a wife or a mother, but as a woman. And that, in itself, was a gift I had forgotten how to accept. But was it fair to continue down this path? Ethan had his whole life ahead of him, and I had my years, my responsibilities, my history. I couldn't deny that a relationship with him would come with challenges. People would talk. I'd be judged, maybe even scorned. I closed my eyes, thinking about the world we live in. The world that would look at us, and perhaps see only the age gap, not the emotions that had developed between us. There was so much to consider. My heart was torn in two, one part desperate to embrace the love I was feeling, the other part fearful of the consequences. In the end, I realized that love wasn't about age, or the opinions of others. It was about connection. It was about how someone makes you feel seen, cherished, and valued. And if I was going to follow my heart, then I would have to face the risks, no matter how frightening they seemed. I knew that this could be the beginning of something beautiful or something that would tear us both apart. But for the first time in a long time, I was ready to find out. And for the first time, I didn't feel alone. The next few days passed in a blur, filled with moments of excitement and doubt. Every time I saw Ethan, my heart would race. He would smile at me, and I could feel the warmth of his gaze, the energy between us that had grown stronger with each encounter. But then, the reality of our situation would hit me, and I'd pull back, unsure if I was being reckless, or if I was finally allowing myself to live authentically. I knew what people might say. I had heard the whispers in the grocery store when Ethan and I bumped into each other, the way their eyes would linger for a moment longer than necessary. It didn't matter that we weren't doing anything wrong. To them, the gap between us was all they would see. But I couldn't control what others thought, nor could I ignore the way he made me feel. When Ethan finally invited me out, a small part of me hesitated, worried about what this might lead to. But then, as I stood at the door, watching him walk toward me with that same playful grin, I realized something. Life was short, and I had spent far too many years living for everyone else's expectations. I had spent years suppressing my own desires, my own needs, my own joy. It was time for me to choose me. So I made the decision to embrace this connection, to see where it could take me. I could not predict the future, nor could I change the opinions of the world, but I could choose to be present in this moment, to feel what I was feeling, to savor this connection for as long as it lasted. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was truly living. In a world that often told me what I should or shouldn't do because of my age, I realized that love doesn't have an expiration date. It's not about the years between two people. It's about the passion, the trust, and the connection they share. Whether I was 53 or 23, I deserved to feel seen, desired, and alive. So I took his hand, and together, we stepped into the unknown. Whatever lay ahead, we would face it together. No judgments, no regrets, just love in its purest form. And that was all I needed. Love, after all, has no age. It's timeless, and so, too, is the joy it brings.